dusty road. I'm burning, I'm burning. I can't find the words to tell you how I feel. But we don't have to talk about anything. I can't find the words to tell you how I feel. So I just want to look into your eyes. Oh, one notebook for everything. I don't want to let down the family. Got to keep the name clean. I'm lonely, I'm lonely. I can't find the words to tell you how I feel. But we don't have to talk about anything. I can't find the words to tell you how I feel. So I just want to look into your eyes.
Hey everyone, welcome to Mormon Neurodiversity. This is your host, Marco, and I am excited to finally cover some things and have a YouTube video up after promising for so long. So, first things first, I kind of wanted to establish a basis of what is neurodiversity. And so I kind of wanted to first present kinds of brains, basically, different types of thinking that we know of that we've applied labels to as a scientific community. So, without further ado, I present to you this little markup here, graph. It's kind of a Venn diagram type of makeup there. So as you can see, it concentrates on all the different kinds of overlaps that do exist within neurodiverse brains. You can see here at the very top that little egg, dyscalculia. I probably butchered that. Difficulties with numbers, concepts, and calculation. Makes sense. Dyscalculia. I think I got it that time. And then you can see here that kind of a pinkish salmon, dyslexia. So that's difficulty with words, difficulty with reading, writing, spelling, speaking, listening, etc. And then dyspraxia on its opposite side, they're kind of the grayish blue color. It's also labeled as a DCD. Difficulties with planning, movements, or coordination, and practical tasks, as well as tracking and balance, poor spatial awareness, and muscle tone. And then that tends to overlap somewhat, as you can see down below in the yellow egg, overlaps with autism spectrum disorder. Now that's very interesting, because I have seen some of those things in my son in particular, and then also myself, where I suspect I may be on the spectrum. I definitely can have a poor spatial awareness at times, and poor coordination, especially in sports. So, and then, as you can see here, there's some things that are very specific to ASD, social and communication problems, obsessive interests, and difference in imagination. So, as we go to the bottom, there's the green egg, Tourette syndrome, and these are just kind of tics that are both verbal and or physical tics. So that's another type of neurological development, and that's called Tourette syndrome. We have here also ADHD, or ADD, as it was more commonly known as in the 80s and early 90s. Now this is me. I have adult ADD or ADHD. Impulsive. Yes, I can be very impulsive. It depends, but I can be impulsive, very impulsive. Temper outburst. Oh, this is especially true when I was younger. Oh my goodness. Hyperactivity. Yeah, I was pretty hyper. as a child especially. The hyperactivity kind of presents itself in adults more as restlessness, which I have been described by outside observers. So there you go. Another thing to look at is the low frustration threshold. This can be true, unfortunately. However, it doesn't mean we can't learn to cope and adapt. There's a lot of coping skills available for that. Easily distracted and over-focused. Very true. How do you think it's taken me so long to produce a video for this channel? Anyways, so lack of concentration and distractibility kind of overlap also, as you can see with autism spectrum disorder, maybe a bit with dyspraxia and dyslexia. And combined all together, these create what was considered a group of neurodiverse individuals, so we call it neurodiversity. So it defines as difficulties with organization, memory, concentration, time, direction, perception, sequencing, and then poor listening skills. All these may lead to low self-esteem, anxiety, and depression if others are not aware. They also can be very creative, very original, and determined. Yes, I put the very in there, but I've seen amazing things that people with neurodiversity are capable of doing. And so kind of to go a little bit more into depth about neurodiversity, I'm going to continue on with the next slide. It's actually going to be on my monitor here. Okay, so Neurodiversity 101. The definition is a term that means that brain differences are naturally occurring variations in humans. Okay, so the neurodiversity perspective sees brain differences rather than brain deficits, like deficit disorder. Instead of viewing differences as disordered or needed to be cured, a neurodiverse perspective sees differences as welcome variants of the human population. When we remember that brain differences are natural and welcome, it reduces stigma and increases acceptance. Now, there's the terminology. I've had people like, what's the difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergent or neurodivergence? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we've got the answer right here. So we already have the definition for neurodiversity. Neurodivergent refers to a person in particular. Refers to having a brain that functions in ways that diverge from the societal, that's the key thing there, societal standards of normal. Neurotypical, therefore, refers to someone as having a style of brain functioning that falls within the dominant social standards of normal. And now we have here neurodivergence is a broad term that can refer to several different diagnoses or symptoms. Some diagnoses that fall into neurodivergence are autism, dyslexia, ADHD, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, and cerebral palsy. Now, something that's interesting about this movement is that we were striving to create an identity for ourselves, to reduce the stigma and to reduce that ostracization that sometimes can be felt. So there's a difference between how we refer to ourselves and these certain conditions. There's a growing well, we'll get to that in a second, but first of all, there's this what's been used fairly often as kind of the first-person language approach. That emphasizes the idea of separation from the individual and their disability. So, for example, I am a person with autism. Now, identity-first language emphasizes the disability as an aspect of one's identity that does not need separation. So an example is I am autistic. So notice the difference there. Not I am a person with, but rather I am, and then autistic. So the neurodiversity movement embraces a lot of identity-first language. It helps us position the disability in an identity category, and that's why it's termed identity first, because the identifying word comes first in the sentence and highlights the person's personal acceptance and embrace of their identity as someone as having a different brain, a different way of thinking. So an example is, I am an autistic person like I am left-handed person or a tall person. So what is the neurodiversity movement? The neurodiversity movement is a social justice movement. We are seeking equality, respect, inclusion, and civil rights for people with brain differences. The neurodiversity movement aims to embrace all neurodivergent individuals as welcome and equal members of society. To do so, we must begin to provide the neurodivergent population with the necessary and needed supports to participate as equal community members. Now, a very interesting thing to know here is, especially within autism, we have heard terms of high and low functioning to refer to neurodivergent and disabled individuals. So these terms simplify, honestly, a complex thing, conditions that are more complicated to try to make it more simple to fathom for scientists and laymen alike. So unfortunately, this type of thinking and categorizing, it's a binary. It doesn't allow for a pure understanding or accurate understanding of an individual's actual abilities. So the neurodivergency movement, it does call for a shift in language regarding functioning, as these labels perpetuate biases about what function means. So honestly, this puts people into categories that don't really necessarily reflect their own experience. I know some people who may be termed as lower functioning, but if you actually have looked at their curriculum vitae or their resume or just things that they've done, if it's not academic, it's amazing what they've been able to do in spite of certain limitations that society imposes upon them. And so not everyone can fit into those simple labels of low or high functioning. And another thing to remember as well is the people who may appear to be high functioning, there's a sort of behavior that is used among those people, and it's not just for autistic people. It's also under ADHD and even dyslexia and dyspraxia. You kind of try to fake it till you make it to avoid embarrassment. So masking is kind of what we call that. It's camouflaging. We try to hide it, or we just try to compensate for a struggle. If you have ADHD and you're in the most boring class, you just don't care about the material, and your mind is just everywhere. Often, the coping thing or compensating thing is to doodle. And sometimes doodling helps you actually focus on what is being spoken. This is especially true if you haven't been diagnosed and perhaps not been medicated as well. That's specifically to ADHD, so I'm not speaking broadly here. But broadly, as a neurodivergent community, we do try to blend in with society's norms. A neurodivergent person may really strongly desire and feel a need to hide their differences. And sometimes that ends up changing how they act naturally. This behavior happens often. Especially when the environment is not really embracing or not embracing at all of their neurodivergence. So while we're camouflaging as a neurodivergent person, our traits can have really good benefits. So it's important to note that there are high costs. For example, in a 2019 study, researchers found that individuals who engage in masking reported more stress, anxiety, and depression when compared to those who did not. So, yeah, I mask. And if I go to social gatherings, it especially gets put on. But if there are too many people, sometimes it's so much for me, so much noise and just sensory input happening that the mask falls and I kind of start I'm having my blank face at times, and people wonder if there's something wrong with me, or I'm just like, no, I just need to. I'm just chilling, trying to keep it cool. Again, it depends on how many people there are and how loud it is and things like that. Another thing too is having ADHD sometimes, and it's not our fault. It's not like we don't try to listen, but there's times when we're talking with people about maybe a project for school or for work, but it's not super interesting, or we're kind of like dreading it. And as you're talking with the person who you may be collaborating with, or need to work with, sometimes they may be talking then, and you kind of space out. You're not space out, but your mind just suddenly starts thinking about sometimes super random stuff, or sometimes it's stuff that's sort of related to the task at hand, but not a good time to think about it when someone's actually talking to you. And so, and this can all happen within like a second, or even half a second. Just this rush, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I totally missed like a bunch of what they just said. And instead of embarrassing yourself and making yourself look like a moron, you just kind of, oh, okay. And sometimes you cope with that by like asking a coworker who's working with you, perhaps on that, like, do you remember what so and so said about X, Y, and Z? And unfortunately, sometimes they may not know because it's not actually their job. It's not something they're supposed to focus on, and that was your job. This can create problems in the workplace, and then, as you may be able to think, that also creates problems in academia or as a child, especially for adults going to college. It is so hard to learn, not because you can't learn, but because your brain just needs something much more interesting to keep it focused on something or engaged. And that's ADHD specifically. So I kind of want to just talk about this a little bit more. The word neurodiversity was actually coined in the late 1990s. But people with different brains that differ from other people have always existed. So this isn't anything new. People sometimes say, like, oh my gosh, ADHD, like everyone's becoming ADHD, or everyone's being autistic, or blah, 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 blah. Well, no, they've always been around. It's just that the paradigm and the movement is, it is new, but the diversity is not new. The neurodiversity movement may have highlighted our existence, but we have always been here. And so, we've always been here, and unfortunately, generations before who are neurodivergent have had to cope with it and sometimes suffer horrible treatment and being bullied and cast out and just ignored. So, and especially by family. That's the most tragic part there. So I like this meme. It says, y'all be like, I would never bully someone for being autistic. And then they bully people for being picky eaters and not getting jokes, and not understanding sarcasm, or being socially awkward, or not liking to be touched, and fidgeting a lot, and having cringy interests and having meltdowns. So, autistic pride. Why be proud of something you have no choice over? So, pride. This is kind of the definition here, as you can see. But of course, the most important part of it that we want to talk about is consciousness of one's own identity. And that also comes along with it is self-worth, self-image, knowing who you are, being proud. And so that's the thing that we strive, and I'm working on, is I want to be proud to have rejected the shame that our ableist society tries to put on all of us. And so I want to be proud to embrace my ADHD and perhaps autistic self in a world that tells me ADHD is bad or autism is bad. And I'm proud to say that I am autistic and ADD. I'm not sick or broken, and I accept myself for who I am. So, another interesting thing is many adults with ADHD find that they're most productive at night. They tend to hyper-focus on tasks and don't want to break their momentum. According to Dodson, after the sun goes down, they feel especially energetic and think more clearly. Plus, distractions tend to be low. Bolivardia cited neurological research that found that the ADHD brain is prone to a delayed sleep phase syndrome, or DSPS. Instead of having a typical circadian rhythm, with sleeping hours from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., people have an irregular pattern of 2 a.m. to about 10 a.m., he said. So, yeah, we stay up late, so that's what we like. So, I guess the last thing I want to say is that So, I'll be honest, there was a point in time where I felt like it would be so hard to have children who are autistic and have children who have ADD, and I feel horrible about it because there was a lot of shame that I projected onto my children that was projected onto me from my parents for how my brain was and how I behaved and acted. As hard as I would try to be good and be a smart person and do all the things I was supposed to do, especially within the Mormon Church, it just was never enough. And even just simple things. And so I'm really glad that I have an opportunity to create this platform, and I want people to share their stories about anything that they feel is important, especially within Mormonism and even the ex-Mormon community, with people who may struggle societal with societal norms just because our brains are wired differently. So I'm very grateful for anyone who's listening to this, and anyone who wants to contribute or do anything that would help with content, like sharing a story or perhaps a poem, sharing a musical song that maybe you composed. I'm open to anything. I want this to be a good experience for everyone to share in whatever way is the most effective for them. And with that, I bid you all adieu and happy holidays from Marco and Mormon Neurodivergence. Aloha!